Thank you. So, according to my official time, as provided to me by the world of Apple, it's 9:59 Mountain Time. Actually, it's 10 o'clock on the nose at that very moment right there. It's 10 o'clock, folks. Appreciate those of you who are here on time and ready to participate. If you will, give us like one more minute to allow a few others to arrive, including, I need to make sure our presenter makes an appearance. Thank you, Deb, for the slide deck. See a lot of our...
He's coming on, Jeff.
Excellent, thanks. See a lot of our standing participants. Appreciate that, especially those of you. Oh, Trina, great to see you there. Good morning. See folks from other parts of New Mexico state government and from the various utilities. Thank you. Appreciate those who've put an identifier behind your name so we know who you represent. That helps me as today's facilitator to kind of make sure we are drawing in wide and balanced representation. Everyone gets a chance to participate. Good morning, everyone. This is Gridworks webinar series on grid modernization on behalf and support of the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission. It's the ongoing series we have. This is webinar number 7. I'm sorry. Yeah, this is webinar number 7 about transportation electrification in distribution planning. It is just after 10 o'clock. We are at a good place to start, ladies and gentlemen. There's a good critical mass of you here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for those, especially now and later as we get to engaging with one another, to use your camera, as well as when not speaking, to use the mute. Makes this Zoom world most effective for us all. Just to remind you, and my colleagues are here, there's several of us here from Gridworks, ranging from its Executive Director, Matthew Tisdale, to my colleague in leadership on this, colleagues Amanda Orman, she and I being senior fellows, taking turns facilitating. Great support from Deb Shields and Margie Tatro is also with us as well. Good to see you all. Great to have our folks from Cavala, who I'll introduce a little later. Draw your attention that the reason we're joining together today in webinar 7 on transportation electrification is to be given an overview of transportation electrification as it relates to and impacts distribution system planning. So I draw your attention as those joining in to participate and listen in, to be listening for that not only about transportation electrification, but how it relates to distribution system planning in this context of our conversation on grid modernization. And a reminder, hopefully you're becoming all familiar with this now, of our process, and we'll get to that more later, because we will go through that process of hearing your, what did you hear, what do you need clarified, and then going through our steady kind of deeper dive into the content and into a good practiced and focused facilitated engagement. That's what we'll be doing today. Also draw your attention then, as is our practice, to remind you that the last time we were together on May 5th, our focus on May 5th was on non-wires alternatives or non-wires solutions, as a term of art that's becoming more and more commonplace in this discourse regarding distribution planning, integrated distribution planning, grid modernization. You will find, as is our practice as well, on the Gridworks website under our initiatives and related to the New Mexico PRC, the notes from the May 5th. I will just quickly draw your attention to a few things you will see in those notes. Again, to remind you that it's our way, and this is not meant to be as legible as just as a graphic for you to know that this is available on the website. And it is our practice here to see that we are listening, we are engaging, we are trying to capture what we hear, put it in a format here that we will be building upon as we move forward in helping the PRC toward a notice of proposed rulemaking. As a note today, you'll notice that today's session as well has 15 minutes added on toward the end. We would ask you to stay with us through that whole time, because we want to spend part of that time toward the end talking about an outline of how we plan to communicate to the New Mexico PRC, and get your initial thoughts on that, if you would. To these, the notes, just a couple things to highlight. That's a few takeaways about non-wires alternative opportunities. I think a key piece is that you really can't pursue grid modernization without understanding and incorporating non-wires alternatives, non-wire solutions. They are really integral to each other. We captured discrete ways in the notes that a grid mod process needs to be designed in order to do so, in order to fully incorporate this different approach to planning, to decision-making, to transparency, to engagements, all captured in our bullet points there. We also highlighted a challenge of applying cost-benefit analysis to this particular aspect of planning and of grid modernization. Cost-benefit analysis is a topic you will hear a presentation on June 2nd. So a little teaser for you of what's coming next. We will focus specifically on cost-benefit analysis. You also will find in the notes that the specific takeaway regarding, and several takeaways regarding the forthcoming notice of proposed rulemaking, or the NOPR, because again, is our intent, what we're driving for, what we're striving for here is content to build upon, to give guidance and recommendations to the PRC on that NOPR. So you'll see that that's why we have formatted the notes in that way. And I think it's important that the final thing to share here is that I want to acknowledge this group really is doing a wonderful job of both staying broad and staying New Mexico focused in its attention. And you'll see that in this time in May 5th in the notes, looking at the urban and rural dynamic of New Mexico and raising equity as a question that we need to continue to grapple with and incorporate into such a process. And so you'll see that captured there as well. So that brings us around to today then. So again, thank you for being with us. You see what we're going to do today is move here in just a minute or two to our presentation on transportation electrification in distribution planning. We'll allow our presenters to walk through their slides. Then we'll ask you to respond, both clarifying questions and anything else that just is on that initial grounding with each other of what did you hear? And then we'll go through our more iterative process and engaging to draw out of this session, the same as you're seeing in the notes that we just talked about on the last session. We'll talk about those objectives a little later. As also as our practice, appreciate a couple of minutes of response of how did we do today to today's objectives? How well are we capturing, hearing from stakeholders, engaging with the topic, meeting these objectives? Then we, as mentioned, we'll turn to the report review, and then we will summarize and tell you what's on the calendar for June and July. With that, we're going to transition now to today's content. Thanks, Deb. I will say that, as is our practice here, there are amazing folks that we're able to draw upon as subject matter experts, and today is no exception to that. We're drawing today from an organization called Kavala. And Kavala, although new to me, I'm impressed to look through their website and understand the depth of their work in data and analytics as it pertains to this world of the clean energy transition that so many are going through. And when you look at their website, you see that their work in that space has an amazing spectrum of folks that they either partner with or who are their customers in that data and analytical work. And with us today, amongst her colleagues, that I'll let her reference to her colleagues, but Trina Horner is a director at Kavala. And I would highlight for today's context that Trina brings both a depth of knowledge in the utility regulatory experience as an executive with utility in California for 8 years, and then 7 years in that space of providing regulatory and technical consulting from a variety of positions. So with that, Trina, I think we're going to turn to you, have you do slide sharing and move through your own slides and welcome your own colleagues into this presentation period. So Trina, if you are ready and available, let's make sure your technology is working and you can do screen sharing.
Thanks, Jeff. We are ready, and I'll just do a quick check while my colleague Greg Mandelman starts to bring up our presentation. I just want to thank you and the Gridworks organization and the New Mexico Commission for having us here today. This is a topic that Greg and I are particularly passionate about and really interested in. And frankly, this is kind of what led us to join Kabbalah last year. So,
Greg, do you have access to do screen sharing? Is that working for you?
Zoom, I'm in the midst of setting up. Zoom requires us additional checks, but it should be up momentarily. Just one second.
Sorry to cut you off, Trina. Also to point out that my colleagues have put a link to the slides in the chat so folks can follow along with that. And oh, look at that. And we're good to go. I will go on to mute and let you take it from here. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Greg, for navigating that last step. So we're here to talk over the next 20 or 25 minutes or so about grid modernization in the context specifically of transportation electrification. And so want to kind of move to the next slide of just what we're going to talk about today. I'll give a little bit about our background and background on Kabbalah. We wanted to talk a little bit about transportation electrification drivers, just because that really ends up being informative when thinking about goals, as well as what data you need to be thinking about collecting. We want to talk then about how those drivers have manifested themselves in terms of trends nationwide and also within New Mexico. And then, pivot to kind of the good stuff, the regulatory implications of transportation electrification on distribution system planning. So that's kind of at a high level what we're hoping to cover today. In terms of introductions, as Jeff mentioned, I have some experience on the regulatory side from both a regulator and a regulated perspective. Started my career and spent 13 years at the California Public Utilities Commission in various roles, including chief of staff to the president of the commission, and also have moved then to a large California utility, sort of managing regulatory filings. So definitely bring a lens of regulation from both perspectives there. Greg, I'm going to turn it to you quickly to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Mandelman. I too I've been on the regulated side. I spent 8 years at Pacific Gas and Electric Company. They're largely working in sort of demand side management programs, but very much a part of the regulatory process, getting to sort of witness in key cases, or a key case for PG&E. But then turned my focus in the last couple of years to electrification of transportation, which I'm excited to talk to you all about here today. And I'll be supporting Trina sort of in some of these detailed questions that we might get, but look forward to today's conversation. Back to you, Trina.
Thanks, Greg. So Greg and I actually both came to Kabbalah relatively recently, within the last 6 or 7 months. And I want to spend a minute kind of just talking about Kabbalah. So we are basically a grid analytics company, really founded on the premise that data analysis and analytics really can and should form, more of a cornerstone of energy policy and planning decisions. And we have the technology, in this day and age to do that. So what we do is we take all kinds of data sets, geospatial data sets, relational time series data sets, and we use those data sets to really understand how they interact with each other. And that's particularly important with transportation electrification, to integrate multiple types of data sets, things like power flow, time series load profiles, the locations of grid infrastructure, socioeconomic data, because the transportation electrification space is sort of like a perfect aggregation of all those dynamic factors. And so that's kind of what we wanted to talk with you about today. So if we go to the next slide, just full disclosure, Kavala is a data science and data software engineering company. Greg and I are not data scientists, nor are we software engineers, but we are within an organization within Kavala that is really designed to help translate the data into relevant policy contexts. So from strategic planning to operations planning to program design and rate design. So kind of that's where Greg and I sit within the organization. So moving to kind of drivers of electrification, as I said earlier, it's interesting to sort of ground ourselves in some of the drivers behind transportation electrification nationwide and in our own jurisdictions, simply because that helps to inform what data and analysis is helpful to do, and it helps to really challenge yourself to define the goals that each jurisdiction has for your own policies and programs. So the first set of drivers that come to mind really are the economic ones. And those are pushing electric vehicles and transportation electrification forward really on all fronts. We see on the consumer side, high demand for electric vehicles due to overall lower cost of ownership, both for personal use, for fleets and other corporate and business uses. That is, potentially expected to continue if gas prices, keep going in their current trajectory. On the utility side, transportation electrification presents an opportunity to basically increase throughput, increase customer demand for electric sales, which could potentially put downward pressure on rates. And then from a regulator side, it's really, potentially an opportunity to improve not just grid reliability, but customer engagement with the electric system, which gives an opportunity to improve resiliency and customer response to pricing signals. So all of these economic oriented drivers are really strong themes that we see right now. On the environmental and social driver side of things, there are a number of elements, including climate change by curbing our carbon emissions, accelerating the clean energy transition, improving air quality, contributing to social equity. Transportation electrification provides an opportunity to move the needle on all of these things. And if you share one or more of these goals, the good news is that as we see on the chart on the right here, a significant portion of the transportation sector is generally considered to be in the jurisdiction of utilities and utility regulators to influence. So there is an enormous opportunity here to meet one or more of these more environmental and social oriented goals through transportation electrification. So given these drivers, what do we see as the trends here? So I wanted to kind of pivot now to a few of the where and the whens of zero emission vehicle data and how these drivers are manifesting themselves. So, and this data on this slide and the next few slides comes compiled by the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. And what we're looking at here is reasonably current. These graphs here were pulled as of the end of March of this year. So this first graphic here on the left basically shows the geographic distribution of actual zero emission vehicles across the lower 48 states. Kind of the obvious things here is that, you know, California in the darker blue is you know, not surprisingly the most highly populated in terms of zero emission vehicles. What's interesting and was actually a little surprising to me is that, you know, some kind of is to see the next level down of zero emission vehicle population with states like Texas and Florida showing up as, you know, sort of that next level dark, in addition to states like Washington. And so the second graphic shows how the nation got there over the course of the last 11 years. So just to ground ourselves in what we're looking at on the graph on the right, essentially, you know, the first thing that is most apparent is, you know, this sort of hockey stick uptick over the last 2 or 3 years, in particular, across the hybrid, plug-in electric vehicle and battery EV population, and, you know, with really sort of proportionate increases across all of those specific kinds of zero emission vehicles. So, which kind of tells us that, you know, it's what the spike in it in and of itself is interesting in the population, and it's occurring across all of the virtually all of the available technologies, with fuel cells being sort of the exception. So if we contrast that to market share, there are some differences, but also some striking parallels to the population. And so these two charts here show basically from the same data source, show the relative market share of zero emission vehicles within the transportation sector. There are some overlaps in terms of the states from the previous slide that showed the ZEV populations, California, Washington, for example. And by contrast, the Texas and Florida state market shares are not necessarily leaders, whereas they were based on population. So I think, you know, it's always good to check multiple metrics when gut checking and thinking about trends and making assumptions about forecasting future adoption trends. On the other hand, the time series graphic for market share is very similar to the population. So what we're seeing again is a sharp uptick in market share across the U.S. In the, you know, post 2019 time period, generally again proportional across hybrids, plug-in and battery electric vehicles. It's kind of interesting to note too that particular uptick, you know, it pretty much directly overlaps with the pandemic timeframe. So, it's just another data point to keep in mind there. If we focus in on the New Mexico specific numbers, just quickly, what we see is, again, as of the end of March in 2022, there were 30,768 electric vehicles. This is the population of vehicles, and which is a relatively low number, but the adoption in the next slide really kind of shows exactly the same uptick that we saw across the United States. So while it was a relatively low number population-wide compared to many other states in the prior slide, we do see that the adoption rate is high. So, again, with the pandemic timing overlay of that spike, it's always a good opportunity to ask ourselves, what would change this in the context of New Mexico policies and demographics and dynamics, or what might actually exacerbate it. And so all of the answers to those questions could be a leading indicator that the grid modernization needed to support zero emission vehicles in New Mexico needs to start now if this trend, if this general uptick continues. And one of those key elements for grid modernization definitely happens with vehicle charging ports. So in the next slide, we talk a little bit. This is one of my favorite slides, just because it's almost got like so many green dots as to not be particularly insightful. So what does this graphic tell us besides there are a lot of green dots, which are each green dot representing a charging port. So generally speaking, we see that there are more charging stations in areas of the country with a higher zero emission vehicle market share. That's one key takeaway. That said, there isn't necessarily a rule of thumb yet that specifies how many charging stations a community or a jurisdiction or a state needs to have to support a specified number of zero emission vehicles. And the answer to why that is it depends, because it really depends on where and when that infrastructure is going to be used, and by when, and by whom. So we have a few of the specific states, kind of specific statistics pulled out here on the right. And we see that, New Mexico at this point, with 195 charging stations, again, I think as of the end of March of this year, with a total EV count of just under 31,000. So we have 195 charging stations to support those 31,000 vehicles. If we move quickly to the next slide. Wanted to just kind of call out, so the difference between charging stations, which here in this slide, 187, contrasting with the 195 in the prior slide, really representing kind of just public only charging stations. And then the number of outlets, I think of them as sort of the equivalent of a gas pump at about 457. So 457, outlets to serve those 31,000 electric vehicles. I'm going to pause here. And Greg, do you have anything to add to any of this data before we kind of jump to the regulatory implications?
Yeah, thanks, Trina. I think there's just 2 points I would make. One on this slide is, as Trina said, and I want to hit this point home again, these are public chargers. So those that we sort of describe as sort of in front of the fence. So there are other chargers, namely those in residences' garages, for instance. Single unit family, multi-unit family dwellings have chargers that don't show up in this count because those are not considered public chargers. So just a point of reference there. That said, these numbers are all consistent in that they are all public chargers, not a mix of some public chargers and some residential chargers. So looking at these numbers as a comparison is helpful, but I just want to make sure folks understood that this doesn't include private charging. So that's just the one quick point. And the second quick point is, and it's actually hard to see, so you might miss it, but I think this is a key takeaway that Trina was making in the slide related to what's happening in New Mexico, which is the difference between the previous year, 164% increase. And so, while, to Trina's point, the populations, relatively speaking, are maybe sort of lower, and that's a function of the state's population, the total vehicle population, the rate of change is still pretty impressive. And so just wanted to drive home that point because I think that statistic is not one that might have popped out, but is one that's really worth calling out. So just those 2 points, Trina.
And Greg, if you can quickly just deal with some questions that I'll take now. Are those level 2 or level 3 ports? And presumably that is Tesla and non-Tesla, because I think people understand Tesla has its own unique charging system. Yeah,
great question. Yes to both. So this includes public chargers that are level 2, which typically max out at around 20 kW, and those level 3 DC fast chargers. So that's included here. And AFDC, the Alternative Fuels Data Center, where we sort of the gold standard for this infrastructure information, includes all charging companies, including Tesla.
Thanks. Okay, back to you, Trina.
Awesome. Great questions. Thank you. So want to turn now to, so what are these drivers and trends mean for distribution grid planning? And I think kind of the key takeaway here is that with that rate of change that Greg was talking about just now, really firmly in mind, the time to start having this be on the radar is now, assuming that rate of change stays, somewhere in the same neighborhood as it has been over the last couple of years. So what does this mean for distribution planning? And really the message is that the challenge is that ZEVs require a much more dynamic distribution grid planning approach than traditional regulatory proceedings really look at. That's sort of the bad news. The good news is that, is the same point, that they enable a much more dynamic grid planning approach than is traditionally been done. And the reasons for that, are simply that zero emission vehicles are more dynamic than most other distributed energy resources in many ways. First and foremost, they can be considered both a supply side resource and a demand side resource. The second is that those resources move. So unlike batteries that are basically tethered to the location in which they were purchased, they're going to discharge and charge from that one stationary location. ZEVs can be a supply or demand side resources from multiple locations. For basically, we can't necessarily assume that the place where the vehicle was bought will be the place where it basically is charged from or discharged to the grid. So this is kind of the reason why questions like where and when these resources will appear are even more important. And it's the reason that they're harder when performing grid analytics with regard to zero emission vehicles as opposed to other distributed energy resources. So those grid analytics that are, and dynamic grid analytics are just some of the implications of those we've listed on this page. And we're sort of particularly focused on the utilization elements here. So in terms of future proofing technology, obviously interoperability and hardware and software reliability, AMI data comes into place, and the availability of that data and how often it is collected and analyzed becomes a big question. In terms of utilization, there are all kinds of really awesome questions that come up, and this is really in this middle section of utilization is where the really interesting, from my perspective as a former regulator, the really interesting regulatory issues come up in terms of cost recovery. What is the aggregate impact on the grid in terms of hosting capacity on individual distribution circuits going to be? What are the load impacts? What are the load profiles of electric vehicles going to be on any given circuit or distribution substation? That relies on understanding EV charging locations, durations, times. Are people going to charge at work or at home? And what incentives are available or exist to sort of manage that behavior, which then speaks to program and market design. And then deployment really comes into play in terms of measuring effectiveness and measuring, what is actually happening in terms of adoption barriers, who has access to electric vehicles and charging stations, and what incentives exist to marry that access up with what your regulatory goals are. So all of these factors sort of come into play with grid planning from transportation electrification. So what are the key questions, right? If we have all of this much more dynamic planning to do for transportation electrification, where do we start? And so I think that the key things that we have found so far is that really planning for an electric utility distribution grid that can support and hopefully also optimize the proliferation of ZEVs. It will take some time. And it also requires going beyond the traditional data sets that are used in regulatory proceedings. So for example, kind of going beyond interconnection requests from EVSE providers, and really trying to anticipate based on all of the data available, who's going to adopt these things and where and when. So what are those key questions to consider? I just mentioned one of them. Anticipating who are the zero emission vehicle adopters, and who are they now, and how should we expect this to change over time? Second, when and how does the aggregate impact of ZEV adoption hit the grid? And does it hit the grid in different locations in different ways? Right. So where on the grid will those ZEVs and their charging and discharging behaviors be located on the distribution grid? And where, when, and how will they charge their vehicles? So, and the reason that all of these questions sort of help to are helpful to be asked at the outset is that it enables grid planners to identify least cost investments needed to support those charging behaviors, and to, again, really optimize them. So it's not necessarily that changes would need to be made to the distribution grid, overall, but that there could be potentially targeted, focused investments that would really optimize the support of this technology. So this is a lot of questions and it's a lot of data. And I tend to be kind of a visual person. So it's sometimes helpful to think about how do the answers to all these questions sort of come together. And we wanted to kind of wrap up our presentation by kind of showing a case study from an analysis that Kavala did for one of our clients, focused on light duty electric vehicles. And in this particular situation, Kavala was solving for what happens if a jurisdiction meets its policy goals for transportation electrification. What happens to the grid? Where and when, assuming we meet our policy goals, where and when do these vehicles appear on which circuits within the distribution grid? And so what we've found over the course of basically a 10-year period is that we can pull all of these where and when data elements together into a visualization that really enables some grid planning decisions to be made concretely. So this first slide kind of shows that what happens, and with each of the green dots being, an LDV, and we see that proliferation, again, solving for meeting policy goals. What do we need to believe happens over time? So in the forecast year 2025, we see about 528 electric vehicles deployed in these specific locations, layering in all of the socioeconomic, geospatial, and time series data that we've integrated together. If we move to the next slide, which shows 5 years later, in forecast year 2030, we see that has essentially, that number has grown from 528 to 3,285 vehicles in these specific locations, each with a green dot. And then finally, in the year 2035, that number has increased to about 10,500. And so again, this kind of visual analysis helps us to really pinpoint the areas that would need to be able, of the grid, that would need to be able to support the kind of transportation electrification that this jurisdiction aspires to do.
Hey, Trina, that's great. If we can probably jump over your second to last slide and go to your summary, because we're about 35 minutes in. And I think if we could, I want to move to some engagement with the audience here in just a minute.
Great. Yeah, happy to. So I think our key takeaways really is that based on all of the data that we're seeing nationwide, as well as in New Mexico, transportation electrification is anticipated to accelerate at sort of non-traditional pace. And the impact of that is really important to anticipate simply because grid planning takes time. And not only to plan, but then to execute, and understanding where, when, and what resources are going to be needed is kind of the key questions there. And the time to start is now, simply because that lead time is significant. So with my apologies for running a few minutes over, I will turn it back over to you, Jeff, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. First off, Trina and Greg, very nice tag team, because as you were talking, we were able to handle a number of clarifying questions in the chat. So that's worked very well. Don't want to put an end to that. Want to just remind our audience now that you've heard today's presentation, to kind of take a breath for a moment. And I think you're already reflecting it, those who've been asking a few questions in the chat, is to first reflect upon just what exactly did you see or hear. I'm picking up now, I'm interpreting what I'm picked up from you, those who've offered questions, that you're hearing a fair amount about the amount of data that supports the world of transportation electrification, and the need for clarification of what that data really represents. And the data sources are critical to understanding what you saw or heard. Looking for more from folks here. Now you feel free to come off mute, use your camera, engage with us. We can drop the slides down, look at each other now, would be fine, and see what folks had. Going to work my way backwards up. Dioko's asking, at what pace does EV adoption set us on a course for 1.5 degrees as an overarching goal? I think what I'm hearing in that too is probably partly to New Mexico and partly to continental wide, if not beyond. But this is the question of, how does vehicle electrification fit into larger goals of carbon mitigation, carbon reduction? Can you speak to that, Greg or Trina, or are we kind of shooting over your head a little bit there?
Excuse me, do you want me to take a stab at that, Trina?
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
That is a great question, first of all. And I will be forthright in saying I don't know the actual answer to that question, because, but I think I can explain, I think the way we would back into that, which is that we know, as Trina presented earlier, that greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector are enormous for the United States, and also for the global economy. And so I think and we understand how we may be transitioning away from internal combustion engines and towards battery electric vehicles through sort of a process of assuming kind of what type of market share you need to have as you transition out and sort of remove internal combustion engines and replace them with battery electric. At what rate do you need to do that? At what rate do you need to transform the vehicle stock and its sort of accompanying emission set in order to hit that target? How much carbon do you have to remove, and how many vehicles do you have to remove to do it? Is the way I think you would answer that question. I think if it, so there, someone has probably figured it out. but
And
I don't have
Greg,
it.
and I think you've got some supporting help coming in the chat, folks
Oh,
pointing
great.
people to a couple of their links and a lot of their narratives. So gets us down an interesting, I don't want to call it a rabbit hole because that may sound pejorative, but I do think it begs the bigger question of interpretation. Still looking for what folks heard, what do you need in the form of clarification? And exactly just make sure we're all sort of hearing the same thing. Art, I'm coming your way in a minute, but I think that's what we're looking for. Same way. I think we're seeing others asking some questions. I'm just browsing back through, trying to kind of move from what you heard to sort of asking some questions about what this means to states. Mary Jane, we'll get to your question in just a moment and try and factor that into this conversation. And Leslie, I see you're setting the line there. Thank you. And Leslie, you popping up reminds me, I want to thank you also for putting the link to PNM's approved transportation plan in the chat. Your colleagues at the other utilities, if they would do the same, that's appreciated because I think that's relevant to this discourse as well. Art, coming to you.
Thank you, Trina and Greg. Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation, and it's nice to see you again, Trina. On slide 10, I believe it was, you reference as one of the drivers downward pressure on rates. And I'm wondering if that is a perception that somehow EV penetration will help put downward pressure on rates, or if we have any actual evidence. Could you explain that particular statement from your slide?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Art, and nice to see you too. I think that the jury is still out on that, and it's highly dependent on what are the other impacts on rates, and whose rates are we talking about? I think in general, our experience is that for that transportation specific rates are still emerging, and that the impact and level of those rates is still being understood simply as the full cost of transportation infrastructure is incorporated or not into those rates. I think what's behind including that as a driver that we had on slide 10 simply is just an acknowledgement that electric vehicle charging, has the opportunity to at least include to increase the denominator in terms of crafting rates. But perhaps to your point, how that denominator is applied and to what kinds of rate schedules is still very much in flux and very different jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like it's actually slide 8, but for those paying attention. Yeah, Leslie and Angie coming to, Angie, I just lost you there, but coming to the two folks from utilities. And Mary Jane, I think your question, I'll get to yours a little later. I think you're starting to interpret some of this, but I appreciate that. We'll take some clarifying questions here still, then we'll pause a minute, talk about our grid process, and then we'll go back to more of a discussion. Leslie, to you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, Leslie Padilla. I'm a corporate counsel for Public Service Company of New Mexico, one of the 3 investor-owned utilities in the state. And I did share our transportation electrification plan that was approved last December by the commission. There's a separate proceeding that the commission started recently about a possible transportation electrification rule. We had a workshop on that, I believe, was it just last week? And in advance of that, I was actually doing some research to look at, whether any other states actually had specific rules related to transportation electrification, or whether they had incorporated transportation electrification in any kind of rules. And I only found 2 states, Oregon, which had a very similar statute to New Mexico's, because there is a statutory requirement that New Mexico utilities file and have transportation electrification programs, and California. And California's was frankly a little too complicated for me to understand. So I was wondering if bringing this back to the grid modernization rule, what is your awareness of specific utility commission rules about transportation electrification, or some of the issues you discussed incorporating transportation electrification in distribution planning requirements? Thank you.
Trina or Greg, thoughts on this from a rule point of view?
So if I understand, I want to make sure I understand the question, and it's a good one, and it's probably kind of similar to the rate design question. So in terms of rules, you're basically talking about mandates for the utilities to provide specific infrastructure, or like, are you talking more broadly than that?
Probably more broadly, just we're probably in a really good position in New Mexico to learn from developments in other states, and then particularly whether public utility commissions in other states have seen need to impose requirements on utilities for things that might involve distribution planning or grid modernization as a result of transportation electrification.
Yeah, so I will say that, and Greg, you can kind of jump in here with more specifics. I think that a lot of the questions that we are that we raised in our slides are being addressed in California. Cavala and Gridworks actually are supporting the California Commission in looking at that, and those rules under consideration really do focus on looking at that intersection of kind of the mobile nature of EVs and the where and the when in the context of the distribution planning system. So right now, for example, the state of California sort of does a kind of one scenario that statewide for integrated resource planning that kind of flows through to the distribution planning process. It is now looking at working with the utilities to do multiple scenarios that consider multiple transportation, electrification, adoption, and forecasting scenarios into the official distribution planning process, and evaluating the different levels of costs, what costs are avoided, what costs are added, and that when and where theme, so that it can target the infrastructure investment decisions. So in terms of rules, the current rules, like you said, are pretty, they're pretty complicated, and they're very utility specific, with each utility proposing different rules and different infrastructure enhancements consistent with its own service territory, much like what is happening in New Mexico. And kind of the big game changer in California is more holistically looking at the distribution planning process to specifically incorporate multiple TE adoption scenarios.
Thanks, Trina. I'm going to jump in. And Angie, we're coming your way in just a moment. Just to capture too, Leslie Moore, as a rhetorical response versus a question back to you. I think you've picked up sort of a chicken and egg aspect to the conversation. We're here today putting, with our umbrella being grid modernization, and how needing to incorporate the reality that transportation electrification is happening, including in New Mexico, and how does it fit into grid mod, recognizing in the multidimensional world we're all working in, that at the same time there is transportation electrification planning being discussed. And this is the nature, and we'll get to that actually toward the end of our time today as we look at how to factor this into a report. we are grappling with that reality that things are interactive all the time. It's no longer linear. How does this connect to how does this relate to interconnection standards? How does this relate to community solar and the like? But in this case here, and then just taking off facilitator and speaking from my Colorado experience, it varies by state and situation by what's the statutory initiative. In this case, the statutory focus being on grid mod. Colorado, we pursued transportation electrification because of a statutory initiative and pursued it before even doing rules because there just wasn't time for rules. So we used the statute as the default rule. Here, again, I think the conversation for today is how does the fact that transportation is becoming electrified fit into all the things we've been discussing in grid mod, ranging from forecasting to advanced metering to what's happening behind the meter in homes and in the commercial area. I think that's a key takeaway from this today. Coming to you, Angie, and again, and thank you for putting your link to EPE's plan in the chat.
Yes, of course. I just wanted to make a comment that we agree with Trina's statement about the importance of proactive engagement with customers and advisory services to learn about their transportation electrification goals ahead of time. So we can be prepared with our systems and we don't slow down progress, right? As far as I know, all the utilities in New Mexico in their TPs, they did include advisory services, including El Paso Electric as a part of our outreach plan. So as a part of these advisory services, we are talking to our customers and learning about their goals. This is especially important for our medium heavy duty sectors. I know we discussed light duty a lot today. For light duty, of course, it is very important to identify where those vehicles are. And for that, we see that AMI data is going to come very handy, right, to do disaggregation and identify where those vehicles are located. And for medium and heavy duty, proactive customer engagement is a key to really learn about their goals ahead of time and ensure we do proactive system planning.
Angie, thank you very much. Deb, can you bring a slide back up now that kind of takes us to our format, our grid discussion process? Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you're familiar with this from now seeing this several times, so hopefully it's becoming second nature to you and hopefully it's becoming comfortable with you. It's always challenging for all of us to kind of go through this in a sequence, and it's not meant to be perfectly linear, but it does help us make sure we are steadily diving a little deeper, keeping everyone connected, and are sort of working off a shared sense of what the conversation is. So we've spent some time kind of looking at and responding to what you heard, both in a clarifying way, and then the chat has been very helpful as well. And Greg, again, thanks for responding to the chat. Starting to reflect upon some of that, I'm hearing from folks sort of questioning some queries, some kind of what does this mean? I want to draw anyone else out in that point. Is there anything else that surprised or confused or intrigued you that you didn't get to hear now? We'll spend another minute on that, especially those who haven't had a chance to engage yet. Anything there that intrigued you, surprised you, confused you as we talked about transportation electrification in the context of distribution planning. I'll take just a moment here, allow for some silence and see if anything else comes up verbally. In this case, not looking for it necessarily to come through the chat. Brian, thanks. Jump on in, sir.
All right, can y'all hear me? Yeah. I think one thing that stood out to me definitely is the point that, a lot of this stuff takes time, right? And just the long-term kind of nature of it. And I know that, the PRC is trying to get a rulemaking done pretty quickly here by the end of the year. And it is curious to me just to see how that would work. If there's something that's very long-term that needs to be done here, particularly regarding development of rules for, distribution planning and transportation electrification, how that fits in to the need for a rule by the end of the year.
Thanks, Brian. That's helpful. And that's fits nicely as a model of sort of a reflection. That's sort of just something that catches you, gives you almost a, in the world of how the human mind works, of reaction versus response, and which one, how much of the brain you're engaging. Jim, I see your hands up. To you, sir.
Thank you very much. And I kind of want to respond to Brian's comment. I think we kind of have two clocks here. So you have one clock that's the adoption curve, and I think it's going to be difficult to estimate how fast that clock is going to move, and it could be kind of unpredictable. And as we can see in the presentation, the adoption curve is increasing substantially, and that could be just the beginning. So we got the adoption curve clock, and then it sounds like we have the regulatory clock. But my question is, how do we keep those in sync?
Okay, and that gets to you're making some connections, helping with some connections with interpretationists. We're going to get to that in just a moment. So I don't want to lose that, Jim. So thanks.
Thank
Hearing,
you.
yeah, so that there are two different things, if not several different clocks going on here. But just to paraphrase, how does the regulatory process stay in sync with the market and other processes? It goes all the way back, I think, in some ways to the initial slides on TEP drivers and how those drivers all have a timetable on them on their own as well. You know, to similar, I think, Mary Jane, I'm sliding way up to try and find your note from earlier in the chat, because I think you were moving us in a similar space, but I've lost it. Was there something you wish to add, Mary Jane?
Well, no, it was just putting out there, I would be remiss in not asking the question on behalf of our state of New Mexico climate action team, who are asking these same questions about how to structure the transportation network with an eye toward the future. How much flexibility is put in terms of planning, you know, how people pay for the chargers, and of course where they're located. That's their bailiwick. But I'm just wondering, from a technology and planning perspective, how much flexibility should states be looking at?
Thank you. I'm going to leave those both hanging as sort of rhetorical without responding. Back to another Brian over at the Renewable Energy Transmission Authority. Oh, are you there, Brian? No, there you are, sir. I think you're muted, Brian, or you're having tech trouble. Oh, you're back on mute from my perspective. There you go. Now you're off mute, but you're not coming through. I may have to just, oh, yeah, we'll have to try and come back to you, see if we can get your tech to work.
Or write it in the chat.
Yeah, or Brian, thanks. Thanks, Amanda. Or if you can put that, your comment, thoughts, question in the chat, that's helpful as well. Thanks. Okay, folks, and let's see, continue the dialogue with each other now, and as to what you're hearing, because you're starting to reflect and move towards interpretation, making these connections, both connections as to how do these different moving pieces, how do they get integrated into regulatory process, paraphrasing Jim's comments earlier. How does the reality of what's changing around the commission and around the utilities get factored into the commission's regulatory process? And then to Mary Jane's point about flexibility, how do you build that flexibility into the process as such? Looking for other comments from folks, both as you move from what you heard and what kind of response and reflection, reaction you had to it, to kind of what does it mean to the reason why we're having these conversations now? What does it give you, any new insights into this regulatory process, into the notice of proposed rulemaking and the rule on the horizon, and how this fits into grid modernization and the distribution grid? Other thoughts on that? I've heard from a couple of the utilities. I think there's at least one or two other utilities in today that I can put on the spot in a minute, but just looking to see who else has insights or connections as to what you've heard today. And feel free to include in those results. Okay, Darren, I see you coming in from MNerd. Hello, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight another point, just on the total energy used in the state. In 2019, EIA data will show that we used about 130 million BTU per person per capita for transportation. Basically, petroleum usage in the state was 130 million BTU per capita. Electricity was about 40. So transportation, and a lot of it is the long haul truckers coming across the state on I-10 and I-40, but still they're it's all energy being used in the state. So we're talking a 3-4-fold increase in energy use if we electrify everything. Now, maybe the long haul truckers will be hydrogen fueled, but still there's going to be a large uptake in energy use. And the problem with vehicles is they don't use them like our buildings do, kind of slowly bleed it over time. They'll use it, at a hydrogen conference, a Lano engineer said, filling up your gas tank, 14, if you assume you fill it up at 14 gallons in 3 minutes, that's like plugging in a 10 megawatt power source to that vehicle for a short time. These are going to come in very high speed, draws, on the power grid. And, so it really becomes a resource adequacy question. Can the grid keep up with the demand? And, the private sector and the oil and gas sector has done this well for 100 years, but they had a good head start. I'm afraid we're not going to have that kind of a head start on our grid. And I think I just want to say time is of the essence.
Thanks, Darren. I appreciate that point, and that that's part of this planning process and the dynamic nature of that. Matthew, I see your hand raised, so back to El Paso Electric.
Yeah, and in regards to the last comment, that has been something that we've given thought to, given the fact that El Paso does have an international airport, and the electrification of planes is something that we've considered as well. And the idea here would be, from our end, this is the integration of EV as a DER, where you would have these massive users such as the airport, a truck stop terminal, specifically right here by the border in El Paso. You would more likely than not have large scale batteries. And the nice thing about that is you would be able to use it for various purposes on the grid support, the ability to go ahead and maybe tap into that for additional energy during peak periods. So again, this is an opportunity, or actually not an opportunity, but another clear signal that the line between where the system begins and ends is no longer strictly at the meter.
Thanks, Matthew. Appreciate that input. So it's been great to hear from P&M and EPE. Mike, anything from Excel or any of your colleagues, and put you on the spot to get any other utility perspective here?
Thank you. I guess from our perspective, it's nice to try to take a look at a holistic approach to this electric vehicle marketplace and how it integrates into the entire grid modification grouping that we have here. The one thing that the EVs will do, as many have stated, is that it's going to increase electricity use. So if we do it intelligently, have most of it done off peak, that will improve utilities load factors. It will drive down the cost of electricity per customer. So I like the aspect of the holistic approach of trying to integrate it into the total grid mod instead of doing a one-off. And so that's kind of our perspective on that.
Thanks, Mike. Folks, doing great in terms of interaction, both with each other and with me, and staying down our path here, making some of these connections on this, continuing this conversation, what you've heard from the start of the presentation and through that presentation, and from clarification through reactions, and then more engaged responses to now interpreting. want to capture your thoughts and hear, based on this discourse, about how these pieces interact, based on what this means to data and modeling and reading markets and putting into regulatory process. The takeaway every week is what should be captured, what should be proposed in the language that should be considered as a proposed rule goes forward. What else should be addressed further? What things, and I think I heard this in some of the other discourse, is kind of a sense of inbounds and out of bounds. Anything else that we can now distill out of the conversation you've heard so far? Admittedly, we're doing this quick. We're going through this the first time, but want to see what are you getting as takeaways now that, for the good of the conversation, we should capture here in the next 10 minutes. Dylan, I see you, and then Tayoko, and then Leslie. Thank you. Got you three in order. You able to come off your camera and off mute, Dylan?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. I was just following up on the comment that Margie made, and she made a great reflection about how New Mexico is probably not going to be the EV leader in the United States. At least we'd love them to be. But if they're not, how do we look at other states for what they're doing with their distribution systems? And then I was reflecting on that and thinking about how Norway is 75% of new car sales are EVs in Norway, and looking at not just in the United States, but elsewhere for other locations where they're having to deal with these issues, and how do we mimic what they're doing instead of reinventing the wheel?
Thanks, Dylan. Tayoko, then Leslie, and then Mike. There you are. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jeff. It's great conversation, and just having spent 2 years of my life working on the interconnect manual and the whole limitations that the grid was creating for us right now in terms of interconnecting rooftop solar and that in the terms of what Jim had said about the pace of change, is there seems to be a need for much more agility within the utilities, the public engagement, and the regulatory commission in terms of this process. It has to be much more tuned to the pace. And so far, the pace that we've even been going on the interconnect manual has been just this long, slow learning curve that we have. So I'd say that one of the challenges and weaknesses of our process so far has been the lack of public engagement in this process. There's a lot of stakeholders who are representing the public, but for example, city governments are not involved in these things, and they have a big part to play in this. So just feel like we have to be able to create some targets and goals that are driven like we have with the RPS. We set a goal and we had a clear mandate of what to do, and then we work toward that solution. And that has to be more integrated, and it has to be more timely and flexible. Thank you. Thanks,
Dr. Leslie, then Mike, and then Matthew.
Yeah. Actually, I'll first just respond to something that Tayoko raised, because that's a good point about engagement in both this process and other utility processes, particularly when we get to the point of having to file applications and have litigated cases before the commission. On our transportation electrification program, which we filed, I believe, in December of 2020, we had I think probably a month-long stakeholder engagement process before we filed our transportation electrification program. And then when we filed, a number of those stakeholders did intervene in our case. But to Tayoko's point, you don't always have the same people. Like the folks who are probably on this call, I would say, are most of you are probably not likely to engage as an intervener in a litigated commission case. Because one, it's very time consuming, and a lot of the issues, I'll say just a lot of the issues that end up being subject to consideration in a commission case are things like cost recovery, and that's where kind of a different group of people start to become involved because of the interests of their constituents, ratepayers. So I just wanted to make that point. We do have robust stakeholder processes for most, if not all, of our regulatory filings. I think the issue that I'm seeing here now with these workshops is that you're getting different groups of people. I also wanted to just make the point, and I made it in the comments. I think perhaps some of the issues we're discussing here today about planning, maybe something that our integrated resource planning rule should, I don't know if there needs to be specific provisions in our IRP rule to allow for robust evaluations of future transportation electrification. As I said in the comments, PNM is already doing that, and of course I would think the other utilities, because we're of course needing to plan for future load. So perhaps, and there's a separate commission rulemaking right now on that would change the IRP rule. Just throwing that out there, that I think some of the discussion that Trina had did go to really making sure that utilities are adequately planning for this, and that really I think would take place in utilities integrated resource planning. Which, and just to plug, PNM's integrated resource plan, I think we're on our second public outreach meeting. I think that is happening next week.
Nice.
Just FYI.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Lisa. Mike, and then Matthew, I think you're going to get the last word to this.
Yeah, Jeff, I guess from the rulemaking perspective, I mean, some of the important things to draw from this discussion is that the IOUs differ in their customer base. So it's really important for the rulemaking to be flexible to each utility's load. SPS has a high commercial industrial load. So we're going to have a different customer uptake for EVs. And it's real important to really look at that existing statute as the guide. You mentioned Colorado doesn't have a rules in place, but they go off the statute, and that's what we're doing now. And so maybe more of a limited rulemaking may be appropriate for New Mexico. I guess one very important aspect, again, to incentivize the addition of infrastructure for refueling is that utilities need to really have a amortization and capitalization of our rebates. So the rebate programs that we put forward to try to improve the infrastructure for refueling, those should be considered for cost recovery, return on investment, and that would go a long way to helping the chicken and egg problem in New Mexico. And I guess finally, as Leslie mentioned, with her stakeholder processes with the IRP, having those continued stakeholder processes, we've all filed our TEPs, utilities, but it's a first shot, and we're going to learn a lot from those plans, and we need to have continued stakeholder engagement to make those plans better. So we look forward to having all those kinds of things in a rulemaking.
Excellent, thanks, appreciate that. And thanks to the chat, trying to also draw in who else we should reach out to. Matthew, to you, the last word, and then we're going to wrap this portion up.
Yeah, and actually, Mike jumped on a lot of the points I was going to make. At the end of the day, what this comes down to for us is we got to make sure that we have the appropriate cost recovery on there, because at the end of the day, what I'm hearing throughout this entire endeavor has been a need for pushing us forward, which does require a lot of capital investment. And we got to recognize that we cannot have a California appetite with a New Mexico budget. And so we have to move intelligently. And if the commission so decides to take a aggressive tack, then they have to be willing to accept experiments and accept the fact that the ratepayers will, bear the cost of those experiments.
Thanks, Matthew. I always appreciate you referencing that budget and appetite. Mike, I'm presuming you still just have your hand up from speaking a minute ago. What we're going to do now is head to drawing this portion to a close. Thank you again, as we've done many times now together, going through that facilitated process of engaging with you at deeper levels has been rewarding to us. I think you see it reflected in the notes from our previous sessions. With that, and back to our screen, Deb, we're going to continue our practice of getting some immediate feedback to how today worked in regard to did we accomplish today's objectives. Deb, if you would do that, basically we're going to do the survey right now, ask people to respond on the 1 to 5. I believe it's 5 being strongest and 1 being weakest on that. How well did we do today? So if you would respond to that just quickly, let us know how we're doing. We appreciate the immediate feedback and a commitment to constant improvement. Looks like pretty good response there. I think a few of us that are part of the team don't respond, so looks like 30 is a good number to aim for, Deb. So if you end the poll, share the results. Yeah. Very good. We appreciate that. Feedback is always helpful. And don't need to put you on the spot. We often appreciate the candor of what's not working well. And feel free to reach out to us if you don't want to do it or privately through a chat right now. You know, I think you have our contact information. Give us feedback as to what else could be done better to make this process the most productive for you and for the end results. With that,
have these been shared? Can people see what the survey results are?
Yeah, it's always a great question. Deb, was that shared?
Yes.
Yep, looks like we have. Great. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. With that, we're going to transition over to what we mentioned and why we're asking you to hang on for a few extra minutes and talk about the report that's forthcoming. So with that, I turn to my colleague, Amanda.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And Deb, can you make that a little bit bigger? You all received this week this outline, and what we wanted to do is provide the outline of the report that Gridworks is going to be preparing for the PRC, because we wanted to inform you about how we're thinking about this final report, but then also show you how the input that you're giving is being reflected. So it's so small you can't read this, but I want to Deb, I don't know if I have control. Can I get control of this? So we have a number of different sections in the report, and I'm going to go off memory here because I don't have the report pulled up, but we're going to provide some background and history. What is grid modernization in New Mexico? What is the law that's been passed? What has MNERD done in their white papers? So the first section is going to be about background and history. Yeah, Devonette. And then the second section, we're going to just talk about who Gridworks is and what we do. What was our charge from the New Mexico Commission? How do we work? How did we do these webinar series? So that's all kind of background on Gridworks. Again, Deb, if you could blow this up, that would be great.
I can't make it any bigger, sorry.
Okay. Then we are going to go into a section 3, which is definitions, components, and purpose of grid modernization elements. And this section is to talk about why have we chosen the types of sections that we have, or webinar topics as we have. You all know that the House Bill 233 has a slightly different list than what we have concentrated on in this webinar series. So we want to have this section talk about why should we focus on AMI or other types of technologies going forward. So we have a section here talking about why these are key components of grid modernization. Deb, go to the next page, please. So section 4, if you look at this when you pull it up, and it is posted on the Gridworks website, section 4 is going to talk about the different elements of grid modernization. And from section 4 on is really where I think that you will see your input reflected. We are going to have a section that talks about cross-cutting of grid modernization, and how grid modernization rules touch other rules at the commission. We have an example, I think, of where AMI crosses over into other technologies. If you can't collect the basic data, you can't do EV planning, you can't do distribution level planning. I'm going to have to pause here for a minute because okay, great. So Matthew just provided a link to the grid.
Yeah. So folks can get their own copy of it and follow along with you.
Right, and so I can see it. Okay,
Great.
so section 4 is the cross-cutting topics. So we'll talk through how does the grid modernization rule affect other rules, which I know we've talked about in this webinar as well as another series. And then we also are going to have a section where we reflect back a lot of what we heard from you related to different topics. So we have some takeaways from the distribution planning workshop. We will have takeaways from the AMI and communication workshop. When you look at this outline, I need you to be aware that we are just throwing some information up there right now to give you an idea of the flavor of what will be in the rule. This is not complete, and we've tried to identify that sections may include more information. It may include different information, but we're just trying to give you a flavor of what we're going to be producing. So then in section 5, we're calling that putting that all together and the interrelationship with other grid modernization pieces. We're going to put together a flow chart for you because a lot of times it's just helpful to visually see how the pieces interact. So you can expect that in the report. And then we are going to talk about interaction outside the grid modernization rules. So I misspoke earlier. Section 3 is about how the grid modernization rule pieces interact together. And then section 5 is about how they interact with pieces outside. So we've talked about interconnection rules. There is obviously key dovetailing there, but that's outside the scope of this report. I hope that wasn't too confusing. I apologize. So those are putting the pieces together. And then part 6 is going to be key process and procedure recommendations. This has been one of our key charges from the start, where we want to help the commission think about how do utilities put in an application for these different grid modernization pieces, and then how does the PRC evaluate those. We don't have any content listed in the outline right now. Those webinars will happen in June 30th and July 21st, but we wanted to put that placeholder out there. Then we'll have a conclusion, and our appendix will include meeting notes and participant list. So that's how we're thinking about going about this report. I know that everybody writes things differently. This is how it makes sense to Gridworks. So we look forward to be able to getting more information out there. And as we've always said from the very top, we love hearing your input on these webinars because that's what's going to make it into the report. So we have a deadline, I think, of producing this report by the end of August. So we're going to start putting this together, start filling this out based on all our notes that we have right now. And the one question I have is I know you haven't been able to see this on the screen, but I hope you had a chance to look at it prior to the meeting. Are there any things that you think we're missing that were not covered, or sections that you think are important to address? So Deb, you can take that down. Anybody have any comments about something I may not have covered that you think is important to cover in a final report? And if I hear nothing, then I will assume we're on the right track, and we will keep marching forward with our development of these final pieces of the webinar series and then a final report.
Thanks, Amanda. Excellent. Yeah, just pausing one more minute, see if anyone else has anything else to share there. Otherwise, I'll take the couple extra minutes here before we go and keep the slide up, Deb. This is great. Just to also affirm, thank you all for using the chat. Brian, thanks for putting what you couldn't get to us verbally in the chat and asking your question about storage. So we've noted that, duly noted. Also picking up from the chat, conversation about cost management and review and how that fits into this. The interactivity of a new load, particularly EV load and rate design is reflected in there. A variety of engagement through several parties about stakeholder engagement as part of this process. Thank you for that too. There's a lot to learn, both how we do our work here, how utilities do their work, and just what does it really mean to engage stakeholders. It's one of those perfect examples of why we use this process, because there's different definitions even of what is a stakeholder and how do you get effective stakeholder engagement. And even Teoko, to your comment just a minute ago, in terms of, yeah, this is all reflecting on the interactivity of everything we've discussed so far. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, you can see that we have done our best to continue on a path here of taking discrete bite-sized pieces of a very large conversation that brings us through everything you've seen, from setting a general context for what is distribution system or integrated distribution planning, to the use of advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, to load forecasting, to hosting capacity analysis, to non-wires solutions, non-wires alternatives, to the role of a particular new anticipated load, in this case, transportation electrification. What you see on the screen in front of you, I'm sorry, actually two different dates should be there, but our next time together is June 2nd. Our next webinar there is grid investments and basically evaluation, benefit costs, and how benefit costs is evaluating. And a colleague of mine from the Regulatory Assistance Project, John Chanot, will be with us. An update to your notes, that's the last bullet, actually is June 16th. And that one, we are vacating that date on your calendars. We will not be convening on the 16th. And rather, that just gives us and others more time to see and capture what we have so far, and then carries us into our final times together on the calendar in July as we take the discourse. Thank you, perfect. And actually June 30th, I was calling it July. As we get into process and procedures for this, understanding that many of you have done a very effective job of helping us connect this to the real world of regulatory process and utility process, as well as stakeholder engagement process. How does all that now start to get manifest into thoughts about a draft rule? And then we'll use our last time together on the 21st to recap, summarize findings, recommendations, while we continue to work on the report that Amanda just outlined for you. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let me one more time just see if there's anything else, folks who are still with us, and thank you for many of you staying with us over our normal 90-minute time. See if there's anything else that you wanted to articulate that either wasn't reflected in the chat or in the comments so far, or you've had more time to think about what you heard from Amanda. Otherwise, thank you, Mary Jane, for your comments in the chat. And a good shout out to the Transportation Electrification Summit coming up on the 9th of June. You see some information in there. Doing a very good job, all of you. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to your continued engagement. Think of others who should be participating as well. We appreciate any feedback in all forms and channels. So with that, we will draw today to a close and wish you well and see you in 2 weeks. Thank you much.
Thank you.
You.
Okay, Isaac, I took the liberty of stopping the recording.
Curtis, if you're still with us, and